Okay, hi everybody. This is Daniel Karapkin speaking to you from the Bayit in Thornhill, Ontario. We are studying Moreh Nevukhim, and we are on the webyeshiva.org platform. We've been doing this for quite some time, so we're already in the third and final section of the Rambam's guide, and we are up to today, chapter 16. Let's get our bearings. The Rambam is talking about God's mastery and control of the universe. That really is what section 3 is all about. And the primary focus and really the destination where the Rambam wants to get to is divine providence, how it is that God interacts with our world, a completely transcendent God, the God of that is really closer to the Aristotelian depiction of the prime mover, who is so removed and disconnected from anything of the corporeal realm. How is it that such a deity still is in some way involved with our world and is operating it and interacting with it to the point where human beings can expect reaction from God for their behaviors and for their virtue, and conversely can expect retribution and harm as a result of their evil. And so part of this whole discussion involves the Rambam, as he has in previous chapters, discussing the existence of evil, because if God is responsible for everything that occurs in the world, how can a perfect God give rise to evil? The Rambam is now moving from the same question of the theodicy question, the ultimate theodicy question of why do bad things happen to good people and how does God allow evil to occur in the world, really moves into this discussion that is leading us towards divine providence, God's involvement in our world. And so that's really where we are. And chapter 16 really is a foundational chapter in the sense that it is really going to form the foundation for chapters 17 and 18, which is really the meat of the Rambam's theology on divine providence. So I'd like to share my screen with you because I think you're going to benefit a lot if you follow along with our outline for today. It's easy to get lost in some of the jargon of the Pines translation of chapter 16. So we want to try and cut through all of that. Chapter 16, by the way, in the Shlomo Pines edition, is on page 461. So, as I point out at the opening of this outline, I make just my standard observation. This chapter, actually, the title of the way I would put the title of this chapter is "Philosophers Who Reject Divine Omniscience Do More Harm Than Good." And the reason for this title will become apparent momentarily. So I just make a note at the beginning of the chapter. This chapter is a necessary prerequisite to the next sequence of discussions that deal with the far more important discussion of divine providence. Before stating his belief in God's involvement with individual human beings, Rambam must first establish that God is absolutely sentient and aware of everything that transpires, at least within the affairs of human beings. This is necessary because, especially in light of the existence of evil, because, as we'll see, there were certain philosophers who took a direction based on the fact that God is ultimately good and based on the fact that God would not allow gratuitous evil to occur in this world. He must not be aware of what's going on. That would be one way of solving the problem, but that's why philosophers who take that approach do more harm than good. And that's what's going to become apparent in the ensuing chapters. And so you really need to talk about divine knowledge before you can talk about divine providence. Providence means God interacting with this world in some proactive way. First, God needs to be aware of what's going on in order for him to properly interact with the affairs of human beings. And remember that when we talk about God's providence, the Rambam, at least at this point, is really focusing upon the providence as it pertains to human beings, not as it pertains to plant life or to animal life, but specifically to humans. So point number one in our outline. Philosophers sought to solve difficult challenges to their understanding of God with respect to his knowledge of things other than he. And that's actually a very interesting way of phrasing that philosophers struggle with the idea of God knowing things other than himself. What does that mean, knowing things other than himself? Well, as we'll see, there's a philosophical position that's taken by a group of philosophers that suggested that God's knowledge is limited to knowledge of himself. Because once God starts to know things that are outside of himself, that becomes a challenge to the unitary nature of God. We'll get to that in just a minute, but that's really what the Rambam is foreshadowing. So the first thing the Rambam wants to point out is that these philosophers who have struggled with this question have erred greatly. I will explain what questions led them to this erroneous conclusion. I will also explain what the Torah's view on this matter is and why we oppose their beliefs. Point number 2. The greatest difficulty presented to divine knowledge is the fact that there is great disorder among human beings. Now, I notice that the Rambam uses the term disorder or a lack of order. He doesn't say a lack of justice. This is not a moral argument. This is an argument based on the fact that if God is perfect, then everything needs to be perfectly ordered in the world if God is in somehow involved or at least knowledgeable of what is going on in our world. And what that means is righteous humans suffer while wicked individuals prosper. Not that there's an injustice here, because obviously there is, or an apparent injustice, but this seems to be a sign of some kind of chaos or randomness in our existence. And the only way that that could possibly be true is if God in some way is disconnected from that. Because if God is directly plugged into the chaos of our world, then that would mean that God is either responsible for the chaos or God himself is chaotic in some way. And that doesn't seem to be consistent with everything that we've established about God to this point, and that which philosophers concede to as well. So this caused them to conclude that one of two things must be true. And the Rambam's structure of this chapter is extremely organized, using a very logical sequence of argumentation. So one of two things must be true when we notice chaos and we know that God is the antithesis of chaos. Either God is unaware of what transpires to human beings, or God is aware of what transpires. And now we're basically creating a tree with two branches, and those branches are going to develop their own sub-branches. So let's see where either of these possibilities goes. On the side that God knows what is transpiring, one of three things must be true. We create three branches on that branch. Either God is arranging for these events to transpire, that is, God is exercising correct providence, and they are thus the best things that must occur, contrary to what appears to be the case. So even though we may see seeming injustices and things that seem to be random or chaotic in our world, really it is only an error that we are making from a human perspective. So that is one possibility. And it could be that God is aware of everything that's going on, and everything that God does is just and proper and appropriate for every single human being. Possibility number 2, God is incapable of interfering in what transpires due to his lack of power. So if you say that God knows, the second possibility is that the fact that he allows chaos to run its course because he doesn't have the power to interfere. Third possibility is God chooses not to interfere despite his ability to interfere because of his contempt for man or his jealousy of him. This would be no different from a mortal human being who possesses the ability to help another person in need, but refuses to do so out of his malevolent nature or his jealousy of that other person. These are, the Rambam says, the only three possibilities if we maintain that God is aware of what is transpiring in our world. Next point. Philosophers who carefully regard God and who possess proper knowledge of him know that 2 out of these 3 possibilities are impossible. That is to say, if God possesses knowledge of what is transpiring, one cannot suggest that an omnipotent God is incapable of interfering in what transpires, because this would impute incapacity to an omnipotent God, just simply as a contradiction in God's omnipotence. And number two, one also cannot suggest that God malevolently chooses not to interfere, because this would impute to God evil when God is exalted above the whole idea of being jealous or evil or malevolent. We have thus narrowed down the possibilities to only two things now. So we looked at the branch of possibility that God knows what's going on. We originally started with three branches, but we've eliminated two branches on that contingency. And so now we're left with one branch that God knows and one branch that God does not know. Either God is completely unaware of what is transpiring, or God is aware, but is arranging these events to transpire since they are the best order of things, despite the seeming chaos and randomness of everything. Now, here's where the philosophers then go. The second possibility cannot possibly be true, since our logic informs us that what is transpiring is arbitrary, is chaotic, and without any order, or perhaps you would say justice. These philosophers are thus left with only one possibility. We've completely eliminated the branch of possibility that God knows what's transpiring. And we must therefore go to the other branch, namely that God is unaware of the evils that transpire among human beings. This opinion is fully documented in Alexander of Aphrodisias's treatise on governance, which is also sometimes translated as on providence. This is a treatise that was written by the 2nd century Greek philosopher Alexander of Aphrodisias. It unfortunately has not survived the sands of time in its original, but is extant in an Arabic version and is quoted by a number of different commentaries in addition to the Rambam, to Maimonides. It is all about divine providence. And what's curious, the Rambam's going to come back and quote heavily from this work on governance in chapter 17 in the next chapter. But it is also quite curious that this opinion that the Rambam is now citing from philosophers, unquote, unquote, is really the opinion of Aristotle, as Alexander of Aphrodisias cites him. I think it's quite telling that the Rambam does not quote that this is the opinion of Aristotle explicitly, even though the Rambam considers Aristotle his primary teacher of philosophical science. I think part of the reason is because Maimonides has great deference for Aristotle. And when he sees Aristotle making a fundamental error in his depiction of the universe or God, it seems to me that he's trying to minimize that, because I don't know why he just wouldn't say outright that this is the opinion of Aristotle. But Aristotle believed that the prime cause, the name he gave for God, despite his absolute sentience, is unaware of what's transpiring in this world. Now, the Rambam says that these philosophers committed two wrongs, two evils. A, their dilemma led them to come up with something worse than what they had originally struggled with. Yes, you have a question. How could God be knowledgeable of the evil in this world and allow it to transpire? And you know, that's a great question, and it should trouble you. But sometimes the remedy is worse than the malady. Sometimes the cure is more harmful than the illness. And here, this is what the Rambam seems to be saying, is that, you know, why come up with the conclusion that God, who is omniscient, is unaware of what's going on in this world? That's actually worse than the problem that you originally had. And number two, they seem to ignore something that they had previously always been trying to impress upon us. Now, what is the Rambam referring to? So we'll get to that in just a moment. So first of all, they ended up with something worse than the original problem, because they were bothered by the fact that if God knows what is transpiring among man, he appears to be a negligent God. But in fact, it is worse to suggest that God is unaware of what is transpiring and that these things are hidden from him. That's actually a worse suggestion than to suggest that God is a negligent God. And point number two, they seem to ignore what they had previously said regarding the problem of evil, If you go back to chapter 12 in our section, where the Rambam had a very long discussion of trying to sort of minimize the existence of evil and distance evil from God directly. The Rambam had made a point of citing from Aristotle himself as saying that all evils that occur in this world are really a result of either man's behavior or of the corporeal nature of the world. That is to say, that when bad things happen, it's not because God is orchestrating evil to occur proactively, but rather it's the very nature of a physical realm to contain flaw and corruption. So if hurricanes take place, if people develop cancer, God forbid, over the course of their lifetime, that's not because God is directly involved in inflicting that evil, but rather it's because that is the nature of the physical world, to be filled with flaw and defect, and that terrible things will happen. And so it's not that God is malevolently bringing these things. It's altogether possible that God is fully aware of what's going on, but allowed nature to run its course because that's the way God created the world. And I refer you back to page 443 in the Pines edition if you want to be able to look at that a little bit closer. They seem to forget this point and must thus instead argue that God is unaware of the evils that befall man. It would have been much better for them to stick with the idea that God is aware of all of the evils and all of the tragedies that befall mankind, even to very good people, but but at the same time subscribing to something that they themselves maintain, which is that once God put into motion a physical world that is filled with corruption and defect, these things will often happen just based upon the nature of existence, not because of some deliberate effort to try and undermine someone who is good. Now, we're going to have to get back to this because we're really only touching on the discussion of providence. Really, the main focus of the Rambam in this chapter is really to talk about divine knowledge, just to establish that God is aware of what is going on. He is omniscient of everything. Now, knowing that this position of God's lack of knowledge is disgraceful, the philosophers sought to eliminate the disgracefulness by arguing logically that God cannot possibly be aware of the goings on of this world for the following reasons. So, here's where sometimes, they have this phrase in Yiddish called, don't be an Uber Chacham. An Uber Chacham is a person who's too smart for his own good. So when you run into a problem where you know that something that you're suggesting based on logic really is offensive, what the Rambam calls disgraceful, so you only use your wits to compound even more twisted logic to defend the position that you originally took. And that's really what the Rambam is suggesting here. These philosophers knew instinctively that what they were suggesting when they said that God is not aware of what's going on in this world is really very, very distasteful. And so they had to sort of bolster it and try to defend it by giving some kind of upside down explanation. And not only is it's not a reflection of God's deficiency that he doesn't know about what's going on down here, but rather it's actually because of God's perfection that he does not know of what's going on down here. So he says as follows. First of all, particular components of the physical world can only be apprehended through physical senses. And since God does not possess senses and perceives by pure intellect alone, he cannot perceive particulars. God perceives concepts because God is a being of pure intellect, and therefore particular physical individual components of a physical creation are completely outside the realm of pure intellect and can only be perceived through physical senses, because God does not have physical senses because he is above anything corporeal. Therefore, God does not perceive the particular goings on of this world. That's one argument. Second argument is the number of individual constituents of the physical are potentially infinite. True knowledge is the complete enveloping of all that which is being apprehended. Since these things are infinite, true knowledge, which is what God possesses, cannot possibly envelop all existent beings in this realm. Well, okay, it's a logical argument which basically states that since there are an infinite number of physical components of this world, if this world is an eternal existence, then God's knowledge could not completely encompass the knowledge of everything, because you cannot encompass infinity. And therefore, that's why God's knowledge cannot fully encompass, and therefore, because God's knowledge does not encompass infinity, God's knowledge has no relationship to something which is infinite. Okay, that's another argument. The third argument based on logic is the knowledge of things produced in time would mean that God's knowledge is constantly changing. Since change is impossible for God, he cannot obtain any new knowledge of newly existent things. Since things spontaneously come into existence, and God's knowledge of, let's say, a newborn baby would constitute something new in God's knowledge, that would imply that God is mutable, God is changeable. And since we know the fundamental principle that God is an unchangeable being, therefore God cannot obtain knowledge of any constituent within the physical realm. Now, the Torah community's response, the Rambam says, to this last argument is that God's knowledge is as immutable as God himself. His knowledge of things that came into existence at a particular time predate the existence of those particulars and exist after those things cease to be. His knowledge is thus unchanging. So if, let's say, I have a newborn child, his name is Moshe, and he was born in the year 2000, let's say, so then God would have knowledge of Moshe's existence even at the very top, from the very time of creation, even before Moshe came into existence. And God would know about Moshe even after Moshe ceases to exist. And the same thing would be true about any particular constituent of our physical realm. So the philosophers in turn attacked our approach with arguing that our position is illogical, since according to us, either knowledge can attach itself to pure non-being. How can God be aware of something that doesn't exist? Or the knowledge of something existing only in potential is no different from the knowledge of something existing actually. Again, using logical argumentation, these philosophers strove to eliminate the Torah's argument that God can obtain knowledge of constituent beings within our realm, within our terrestrial realm. All right, point number 8. The philosophers' attitudes about divine knowledge were also not monolithic. So the Rambam then goes, after attacking this school of philosophy cited by Alexander, that suggests that God is unaware, and despite, after quoting how they try to defend it logically, then the Rambam wants to point out to us that there's a whole variety, and this is also quoted by Alexander. There's a lack of consensus about whether God is aware or not aware. Some maintained that God is aware of general species, but not of specific individuals. And by the way, even though that's not something that the Rambam accepts, because the Rambam believes that ultimately God is providential to every single individual human being, and this is something that we're actually going to be reciting over Rosh Hashanah, which is coming upon us in just a few days, Kivakarat ro'eh edro, that everyone passes before God like sheep pass under the rod of the shepherd. And the Rambam very much subscribes to that idea, that there is individual providence and God is aware of every single human being. One school of philosophy maintains that God only has general knowledge, but not specific knowledge of every single particular human being. God is aware about the human species and maintains humanity in general, but not aware of the individual constituents. Others maintained that God is unaware of anything outside of himself, so that God would not possess a multiplicity of cognitions, like other than himself, like we started the chapter with, so that God is completely unaware of anything other than himself, not even the generalities. And finally, there were some philosophers who agree with the Torah view that God is aware of everything and that nothing is at all hidden from him. These great minds lived before Aristotle, and they are also mentioned by Alexander. However, Alexander rejected their view because he is an Aristotelian, based on the argument of theodicy, that we see the disorder of good men suffering and bad men prospering. So to sum up, Had these philosophers perceived that everything that transpires in our realm is properly ordered and just, according to what appears as order to the multitude, they never would have plunged into this speculation of divine knowledge and would have never become confused. It is only because of this perception that man exists in a chaotic world that brought them to their erroneous conclusions. And notice that the Rambam uses the language according to what appears as order to the multitude. And so he's sort of leading us on to where his destination is. We see apparent chaos. We see apparent injustice, but that's only from a human perspective. From a divine perspective, everything that occurs in this universe, in our terrestrial realm, is ordered, is reasonable, is appropriate, and is just. And that's, eventually where the Rambam's going to end up. But then he says, even our own people erred when they stated that they couldn't understand God's system of divine justice. And here he quotes a passage in Ezekiel, which I think is really quite interesting, especially in light of the high holidays that we're about to confront, that in chapter 33 of Ezekiel, the prophet is critical of those people who don't even understand how the system of teshuvah, the system of repentance, can work. How is it, people ask, that a person can commit a multitude of sins, but then rehabilitate himself and have it as if the sins had never been done? And so, uva omrei l'rasha motamut v'shav mechatato v'yasam mishparut tzedakah, that when I say that a wicked person shall die, but then that person repents from his sin, and he instead does that which is just and right, if he makes restitution and he rectifies all of the damage that he has caused, okay, then yichye lo yamut, then that person shall live and not die. Kol chatotav asher chata lo tizacharna lo, mishparut tzedakah asa chayo yichye. Then his previous sins will never be recalled ever again. This man shall surely live. Ve'amaru b'nei amacha, but the people of your nation say, O God, lo yitachen derech Hashem, that God's way is not correct. Vehema darkam lo yitachen, when in reality their way is not correct. They don't understand God's system of justice. People don't understand how a just God can allow certain things to transpire, such as not bringing retribution upon an evil person just because that person has done teshuvah, has rehabilitated his ways. And conversely, as the verses continue, they also don't understand why it is that if a person was virtuous for the majority of his life, but then becomes corrupted later in life, he becomes Darth Vader afterwards, why is that person fall into so much evil, and why is he punished even though he had done so much good in his life? And people don't understand that either. But it's interesting, the Malbim in his commentary says, V'hateshuva lazehu, the answer to all of these questions that people have is, Ish kidracha v'shpot etchem, as the prophet himself says later on. Each person will be judged according to his ways. Sha'ani eini mabit al darko shel atalevad. God says, I don't just look at his current behavior, but I look at it against a backdrop of what he was previously. If a person was previously evil and was able to pull himself out of that mire and make himself into a righteous, virtuous person, then he deserves to be rewarded all the more, because it was an uphill battle for him to pull himself out of his habituated evil. And conversely, if a person was previously good and virtuous, but allowed himself to go down a path of evil, then that person deserves to be punished even more so than a person who was raised with evil his entire life, because he knows what the right thing to do is, and yet allowed himself to be corrupted. And so Rambam says basically, it's true that people don't understand God's system. They see that things are apparently chaotic, but they're no different from the people in the times of Ezekiel who couldn't fathom how God can allow the teshuvah process to wipe a person's slate clean. People simply don't understand, but applying a little bit more thought and a little bit more logic will allow an individual to come to the realization that even things that seem to be chaotic really are not, and there is an order to everything that God does, and there is a justice to it. So the Rambam concludes and says, from this springboard, I shall next discuss the issue of divine providence, which is directly related to divine knowledge. Once that is accomplished, I will be able to return to the topic of knowledge and resolve the doubts about God's knowledge of particular things. So the Rambam is foreshadowing for us the next 5 or 6 chapters, and I hopefully that we'll be able to do those together very soon. We will be taking a break because of Rosh Hashanah, Tzom Gedalia, and then afterwards, the next following Monday will be Yom Kippur, and then it'll be the Sukkot holiday. So we won't be resuming our class until sometime in October, and we will keep you posted. I hope everyone's part of the Facebook group Shiur in Moreh Nevukhim, where you will get all the updates, or at least you're subscribing to webyeshiva.org in this particular course, so that you'll be getting regularly updated. I didn't want to leave the rest of the page blank, so I just wanted you to know that it is interesting to note that even though divine omniscience of every individual constituent human being, at least of our world, appears to be a cornerstone of our faith, at least according to Maimonides, at least one Rishon, at least one medievalist, the Ralbag, takes issue. And I'm just quoting from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is citing from the Rambam's, from the Ralbag's, Reb Levi ben Gershon's philosophy work called Milchamot Hashem, which is readily available in both Hebrew and English. But because it's difficult to extract these snippets from the text itself, just take a look at what this encyclopedia entry says. The problem of the apparent conflict between divine omniscience and human freedom was discussed by many medieval philosophers. So we haven't talked about that conflict between free will and divine knowledge. That really hasn't been the topic of our chapter. Our topic of our chapter is divine knowledge versus theodicy, of why bad things happen to good people. But nonetheless, Gersonides does not follow the majority opinion on this issue. Rather than claim that God does know particulars and that this knowledge somehow does not affect human freedom, Gersonides or Ralbag argues that God knows particulars only in a certain sense. In an apparent attempt to mediate between the view of Aristotle, who says that God does not know particulars, and that of Maimonides, who says that he does, Ralbag holds that God knows particulars only insofar as that they are ordered. That is, God knows that certain states of affairs are particular, but he does not know in what their particularity consists. God knows individual persons, for example, only through knowing the species of humanity. More to say about that, but just wanted to point out that even the idea of divine omniscience being perhaps limited in its particularity of individual human beings, even though the Rambam takes it as a given and as a necessary sort of doctrinal issue within Judaism, but there is at least one Rishon, the Ralbag, who does not agree that it is necessary to believe that God is aware completely of every single behavior of every single human being in this world. But we will subscribe at least to the majority of medievalists who do subscribe to the Rambam's view, which is that God has absolute omniscience, and that is the approach certainly that one would do well to take when reciting the high holiday liturgy of Kivat Karatro Edro, like a shepherd whose sheep pass before him one by one, Kivnei Maron. And with that, I'll leave you. Let me wish you all a Shana Tova, a Ksiva V'Chasima Tova, and everyone should be blessed for the new year of 5784. This is where we'll hold it for today, everybody. And we'll see you, God willing, next month. Okay, take care, everyone.